That's the intent. I turned it on and put it out here so I wouldn't. Oh, okay. You're so smart. Okay.
Don't say anything about the president.
I think I'm on. I'm on. I can hear myself.
I'm a little disappointed I see no one from the health science. There may be some people out there in Arizona, but it's a big place. I should have advertised getting a little vigorous and get some health science.
Good morning. I am Brandon Stump, the Editor-in-Chief of the West Virginia Law Review. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the West Virginia Law Review's third and our final lecture in our series, Beyond Politics, a discussion of healthcare in America. I'd like to begin today by thanking Dean Valerie Vitac for all the assistance that she has provided us throughout this process. I'd like to thank Dean Joyce McConnell, who is unable to be here today because she is ill, but who has also been instrumental in this process. And today I would like to tell you that I would love to extend a special thank you to Andrea Johnson and to Todd Bergstrom, who are the executive editors who helped to implement and to design this entire lecture series, and who were committed to ideas of social justice and thought that they were important. And this series is not possible without the hard work and the labor that they put into this, and they have done a phenomenal job. Today we present Professor Sidney Watson of the St. Louis University School of Law's lecture entitled Mending the Fabric of Small-Town America, Health Reform as Social and Economic Development. While the core of today's lecture will focus on healthcare, there is a layer to this discussion that runs deeper than healthcare. This lecture series is about our society's conceptions of fairness and our conceptions of justice. This series has always been to me about shining a light on those who are left out of the system and for those who have been denied proper care. Today's lecture will continue the West Virginia Law Review's goal in examining fairness and inequities in our current healthcare system by focusing on issues of healthcare for those living in rural America. For all of those tuning in online and for all of you that are present today, I think that you have made a great choice in being here. By a show of hands, how many of you are from West Virginia? And how many of you lived in a rural part of the state? Today's lecture is for you and the people that you grew up with and the people in your hometowns. Today's lecture highlights the story of the people of West Virginia. This is the story of the people in this room. This is the story of farmers living in Preston County, where I grew up, who live 40 minutes or more away from the nearest specialist. This is the story of single mothers living in the southern coalfields who must stay healthy in order to care for their young children. And this is the story of a father living in the rural outskirts of Charleston who must choose between taking the day off of work to take his daughter to the doctor because he and his family only have one vehicle. The West Virginia narrative is a story of a rural way of life. It is also the story of many indigent Americans. For the people of West Virginia and others all across this country who live in rural America, living in a rural community can greatly impact the access that one has to have health care. Professor Watson's lecture will shine a light on this issue. The purpose of our lecture today and of this lecture series as a whole has been to spotlight the intersection of our laws and of our society to show that the law it's more than statutes, it's more than judicial opinions that are documented in old bound books, because the purpose of this series is to show that an exploration of the law is meaningless unless we also discuss those who are touched by it. It has been the goal of the West Virginia Law Review to create a dialogue on health care and issues of access and issues of outcomes for those in this system who have been left behind, and it is appropriate today that we conclude with a discussion that is relevant to the people in this state and the people in this room. I hope that this lecture series has risen above the cacophony of sounds heard on cable news networks. To me, this series is and has always been about fairness. Like the title of our lecture series, it states that this is something that is beyond politics. And that's because fairness doesn't belong to politicians, it doesn't belong to political parties, but fairness belongs to each of us and our own conceptions of what equality means. I believe that we all have the social responsibility to examine disparities and inequities in our current healthcare system and to question their validity, to seek a fairer world than the one that we inherited. And I thank you for joining us in every lecture that we've had, and I'm especially thankful that you're here today. Because the dean is not here, I am now going to introduce our speaker, Professor Sidney Watson of the St. Louis University School of Law. Professor Watson is a specialist in health law and healthcare access for the poor. She has spent her legal career advocating on behalf of low-income people, both as a legal services lawyer and as a law professor. At the St. Louis University School of Law, Professor Watson teaches courses in health law, bioethics, a seminar on access to health care, among many others. In her scholarship, Professor Watson has written on health reform in Massachusetts, on issues of Medicaid, and racial and ethnic disparities in access to health care. Professor Watson is a former member of the ABA Commission on Homelessness and Poverty, and she also served on the National Health Law Program Task Force on Civil Rights and Health Care Reform during the Clinton administration's Clinton Health Reform Initiative. Professor Watson has had an interesting career that has taken her from Louisiana to Alaska. From 1977 to 1981, Professor Watson was the Director of Clinical Education at Tulane University School of Law, where she founded both Tulane's Law Clinic and its Trial Advocacy Program. In the 1980s, Professor Watson was a legal services lawyer in Louisiana and in Alaska. In Louisiana, she served as the managing and senior attorney in the health, welfare, and elderly units of the New Orleans Legal Assistance Corporation. She was also the director of the Farm Workers Legal Assistance Project, a statewide legal services program representing migrant and seasonal farm workers. She spent 3 years in Alaska as the supervising attorney of the Alaska Legal Services Corporation, Bristol Bay office, where she worked with 32 native villages throughout southwest Alaska. Currently, Professor Watson is advocating for improved access to Medicaid services for people with disabilities and for others. And among all of her accomplishments, it's also interesting to note that Professor Watson was a mentor to Professor Matthew, who was our second speaker in this series, and had phenomenal things to say about Professor Watson. So if we could please give her a warm welcome to the West Virginia University College of Law's final lecture in our series.
To be here. This is a wonderful lecture series you have set up. My compliments to your law review for envisioning this series. And not only did I mentor Dana Matthews when she began in health law teaching, your first speaker, Eleanor Kinney, mentored me as I entered the academy. So you have a group of speakers who have worked together and have talked about these issues, and the opportunity to write and talk to you in this lecture series about what we are all passionate about is very important. And I'm so happy that you asked me to talk about rural and small-town America. I think the only thing you miss, Brandon, is that I grew up in South Louisiana. in Cajun country in a very small town. And most of my life as a lawyer, I've worked on the issues of rural delivery, of both legal services and health care. And most recently, what I've worked on in Missouri is kind of what we call the rural-urban divide. Missouri is really a rural state that has two cities stuck on the east and west end. St. Louis on the east and Kansas City on the west. And actually the rest of the state would just as soon those two cities dropped off the map. And we've tried to improve that relationship, learning more from each other about issues of healthcare access and also economic issues. So I want to share some of that today. What I've been doing over the last 2 years is spending a lot of time traveling to rural communities in Missouri and talking about health reform, talking about what it might mean for those communities, and talking about how those communities might get involved. There's lots in the newspaper right now about health reform. This is a fortuitous week. I think the Congressional Budget Office estimates just came out, and we may see a vote this weekend or early next week. And I hope you have my handout. Somebody want to? That gives you some details about the health reform bill. There's been lots of misinformation and lots of noise about it, and that's something to provide you with some real facts about what Congress is talking about. I'm not going to spend my limited time today, though, really focusing on that. I want to set the context for why this health insurance bill, this reform bill, which is really about health insurance, is important, particularly for rural communities. Health insurance is really just a way of financing health care. It's supposed to do two things for us as people: give us access to a doctor and a hospital when we're sick, and also protect us financially from the cost of those bills, both real access and financial protection. It also is really important to people's health. The Institute of Medicine has done a series of studies that show that 118,000 people die every year because of lack of insurance. People without insurance delay going to the doctor, they delay care, and it has a real cost in terms of life and disability, people's ability to be in the workforce and to live healthy and productive lives. Health insurance also plays a crucial role in funding our health infrastructure. Hospitals don't come out of nowhere when you need to go to them. A lab doesn't appear from nowhere. They need stable sources of funding. And just as our roads in Missouri started getting really big potholes in them when we withdrew our financing from them, a lack of stable funding means that hospitals get old, that hospitals move out of rural areas, and that doctors and dentists and nurses don't locate in rural communities. So having a good health insurance structure makes the medical care infrastructure possible. And I want to explain some of how that works and some of how our present system hurts rural communities and rural people in particular. Here are some numbers, and I'm kind of a walker, so let me walk around and also walk where I can remember what you're seeing. Rural communities, estimates are that 15 to 20% of the economies of those communities are connected with the healthcare system, whether it be the doctors providing services, the hospitals, the local nursing home, the pharmacists in the Walgreens or the Walmart or the local pharmacist. And we know that hospitals are crucial to local economies. In many communities, hospitals are the largest or the second largest employer in the community. And in the 12 years I spent in Georgia, what we learned was that small towns lose business, cannot attract new business without a hospital, because people don't want to drive 30 minutes or an hour to get to the hospital when they get sick. So getting and keeping a hospital can be the key to economic development in any towns, particularly small towns looking to revitalize or to stay alive. So let me show you some statistics, because this is one thing we do in health law, is make sure you've got the numbers right. Because actually, if I showed you the numbers on uninsured people in urban areas compared to uninsured people in rural areas, the numbers look very close. What you have to be very careful about is what we mean by rural areas, because many rural areas are actually within driving distance of a nice big town, whether it's Pittsburgh or Morgantown or another. But we also have rural areas that are much more isolated. And what this chart does is break that down. And in very small areas, particularly those with populations less than 25,000, we are now seeing 23% of the population uninsured. That's compared to a national average right now of 17 to 18%. Think of that. That's almost 1 in 4 people without insurance. And here's a slide, and this one gets a little hard to follow, but let me break it down. The top, now that green, those are people who are uninsured, and those different columns break it down by children and adults. So on your far are these rural areas, not close to metro areas, rural adjacent, and these are your urban cities. This is Pittsburgh, this is St. Louis, this is Kansas City. And if you get up there on the top, notice that in terms of children who are uninsured, that little green part is very low, isn't it? We've done a pretty good job of covering children. And the way we've done that in this country is through the state children's health insurance program. Are you familiar with that here? And actually, West Virginia has done a tremendous job of covering all poor children and families up to about 250% of poverty. We have done something similar in Missouri. We have seen the benefits of that program in terms of not only healthier children, but better school attendance and better school scores. It's a real good investment in building healthier lives and what are going to be healthier adults. What we haven't done a good job are those columns that say adults. Notice how very few of them have that yellow public health insurance. How many more of them are uninsured? That's because most of that public health insurance, CHIP for children, is Medicaid for adults. And the way the Medicaid statute is structured is that adults who are neither disabled, permanently and totally disabled, we call that 1 foot in the grave in Missouri, overstated, or who are not parents with children cannot qualify for Medicaid. That is part of the federal statute. A few states have waivers to do that differently, but it means that no matter how poor an adult, they cannot qualify for the safety net. We do not have a safety net for those adults. And the safety net we have can be very frayed. Here in West Virginia, for parents with children, I understand, and correct me if I get my numbers wrong, that the eligibility levels are 34% of poverty, that a mom with a child working about 20 hours a week at a minimum wage job makes too much to qualify. We don't really have a public safety net for adults. What we do have are all those blue lines, which is private health insurance, predominantly employer-sponsored health insurance, the real backbone of the health insurance system in our country. And what I want you to notice is those blue lines are higher for adults in urban areas. private health insurance works better in urban areas than it does in rural communities. And I want to explain a little bit about the history of how we came to use private health insurance in this country and why it works so poorly for rural towns. Because that's what the health insurance bill is going to fix. And that's the promise and the potential I hope to inspire and interest you in today. So how did we come to use private health insurance, employer health insurance? It really all goes back to the Great Depression. Before the Great Depression, we didn't really have health insurance to speak of. We paid the local doctor. Well, the banker paid the local doctor in cash. My grandma, who lived in rural Missouri, used to take a chicken, and I'm serious about this. When she didn't have chickens, she'd take something from the garden and some eggs, and it kind of all worked out. Enough people had money. It was kind of a big sliding scale. But the Great Depression hit, and nobody had money. And remember I said you need a stable source of funding to have that health care infrastructure, and suddenly there was nobody to pay the doctors. There was nobody to pay hospital bills. And we were in a health infrastructure crisis. And a hospital, Baylor Hospital in Dallas, Texas, came up with an idea. And their idea was to go to 1,500 school teachers. And they said, this was about 1930-something, if each of you would pay us $6, we'll pool all that money together, and anybody who needs to come to the hospital, we'll take care of you out of that pool of money. And those school teachers said, hey, that sounds like a pretty good deal. And you know what? It worked. And very soon, the other hospitals in Dallas joined in the same system, so you could go to any hospital, and it worked. It really worked. One of the reasons it works is once you start adding up 1,000 or 2,000 people or 100,000 people or 1 million people, in any one year, about 20% of us use 80% of the medical costs. Think about that. 20% of us use 80% of the cost. 80% of us, we may need a little bit, we may need nothing, but we're okay. And pooling this money made it work for everyone. It also, as medicine learned how to do more and became more expensive, and we got everything from penicillin to x-rays and now CAT scans, this pooling becomes much more important. Because in those years when I'm in the 20%, I don't have enough income to cover my needs. And that's what health insurance allows us to do, really, is pool a little bit of money in the years that we don't need a lot of health care so that there's money there when we do need health care. And what also turned out to work well was this connection with employment. Because if nothing else, an easy way to pay that $6 is to have it taken out of your paycheck before you ever see it. It's also a really efficient way to collect that $6 a month. Because before that time, there was a lot of burial insurance. Are any of you familiar with it? My grandma had it too, where the insurance agent would go door to door and collect the premiums. That's really a costly way to administer premiums. It's really efficient to just have it done automatically. The other thing about employer-based insurance that's efficient is, people take jobs for lots of reasons, and maybe in this day and age, good insurance coverage is one of them. But it's not about being sick. So you end up with a pool of people contributing their $6, some of whom are healthy, some of whom are not. It's a good mixed pool, and it works well as a financing situation. So you want to nod? Yeah. You also add into that, we get to World War II, and the government put in place some wage restrictions because there was a shortage of labor. Because remember, gals, that's when we first started to go to work. We were the welders, remember? But to hold down kind of runaway wage prices, they held those down, but employers could contribute more to benefits. And that's when we started seeing employers contributing to that $6 or whatever it was at that point. So it all works out. It's a pretty efficient system. And by the time we get to the 1950s, this has become the major system for covering health insurance. And these early companies from Dallas, those turned out to be Blue Cross and Blue Shield. Blue Cross for hospitals, Blue Shield for doctors, not-for-profit corporations set up to serve the community, to serve this pooling function. They charged everybody the same rates, put all the money in the pool, offered the insurance to everyone. And from a legal standpoint, they were authorized under specific state laws that gave them a lot of different breaks, including tax breaks and special solvency requirements, recognizing this community service they were providing. It was all working pretty well. So fast forward to today, and let me do a little reality check. How many of you who are students have actually had to buy health insurance? Ooh, does the university provide health insurance? Okay. Here is the average cost for health insurance premiums in the employer market. These numbers are from the Kaiser Family Foundation. Single coverage now averages about $4,800. For family coverage, it's about $13,000. The way to remember that $13,000 figure is that's about what a minimum wage worker makes working full-time all year. You can't support a family as a single minimum wage worker. That is also the average. On average, small employers pay 18% more for health insurance premiums than do large employers. And people who go out and buy individual insurance pay a whole lot more, unless you're Brandon. And I'm going to explain why that is. And here's the problem now we've got. The rural economy is made up of very few large employers, right? We used to have some manufacturing, we used to have mining, we used to have timber. Many of those jobs are going away. To the extent we had any left in rural America, we're seeing this present recession hit those jobs even harder. The large employers who are coming into rural economies are service employers like Walmart and Walgreens with low-wage jobs. About half of the workforce in small towns are made up of small employers. It could be the local doctor, if there is one, the local attorney, maybe you, the local CPA, the local insurance agent, any number of small employers. And more jobs in rural communities are really low-wage jobs. About half of small-town jobs are $7 an hour jobs. They are seasonal jobs. They are part-time jobs, none of which carry health insurance. And many more people in small towns are self-employed, which means they have to buy their own insurance. And every one of these small employers and people who depend on the individual market are hit harder by what has happened in health insurance. And for rural residents, health insurance is more expensive and harder to come by. So there's a reason this slide has a black background. Remember I told you things were working pretty well with that pooling of health insurance? And Blue Cross Blue Shield was doing just fine. What happened was commercial insurers, you might want to think of those as for-profit insurers, realized, wow, maybe we could do that too. Maybe there's some money to be made in selling health insurance. But they came up with a different model. And their different model is called risk rating. What they realized they could do is go out and find the Brandons of the world, particularly young men who are healthy, who don't really need any health care this year, and charge them less than $6. I'm going to charge you just $1 because I think you're not going to need any medical services this year. And you know what? It works pretty well. And instead of putting everybody in one big pool paying the same, what risk rating does is try to identify who's going to be the most risky and charge them more, or not sell them insurance at all, and then try to, I think I did that backwards. You don't want to cover sick people. You do want to cover people who aren't sick and who aren't going to use medical care. And what I've listed up here are some other factors that go into risk rating. It's certainly health status, use of health care, gender. Young women of childbearing age in Missouri are charged 4 times more than young men for the same insurance policy because of the risk of childbirth. Age, older people more likely to get sick than younger people. Occupations, if you work as a farmer, if you do landscaping, if you do anything that involves manual labor, you're at risk of injuries and you will be charged more. Education and income. We know that people with lower education and less income often don't eat as well, smoke more, have less healthy lifestyle. It turns as a marker. Race. If you listen to Dana Matthews' lecture, I'm sure she talked about how health status tends to be poorer in the African American community. It becomes a marker because the last thing that didn't get up there, and residence. Where you live and what other people are like in your neighborhood. I live in an inner city neighborhood in St. Louis. Most of my neighbors earn under the poverty line. I pay more if I buy insurance as an individual because of the zip code I live in, not necessarily because who I am. Because the final item you can add up there is stereotyping. Risk rating is not really a science. It's about guessing who's going to use health care and who doesn't. And it's voodoo. I grew up in South Louisiana. We believe in voodoo. They believe in these stereotypes. But this is how policies are priced and sold. And what ended up happening was the commercial health insurers did a great job of lowering the price of health insurance for healthy people who didn't need it, and pricing out and closing out people who did need health insurance. And Blue Cross and Blue Shield, to continue, had to go the same way. We are now in a world where health insurance is risk-rated, and it makes a difference. And one thing we did as lawyers is we passed HIPAA in the mid-'90s, the Health Insurance Portability, Affordability, and Accountability Act. And one thing HIPAA says is in the large group market and the small group market, health insurers must cover all the employees of the employer. We thought we were going to fix some of these risk rating problems. What we didn't fix was the pricing problem, so that now we see prices going up. The other thing we have seen since HIPAA is that instead of refusing people coverage, what health insurers do is increase deductibles, carve out certain benefits, whether it be mental health or maternity care, to discourage people who might need certain kinds of care from buying their health insurance. What it all means, though, is all of this hits rural communities harder, and it hits small employers and individuals very hard. It is still possible in the large employer market when you've got 1,000 employees or 3,000 employees or 10,000 employees that you've got a big enough pool and a diverse enough pool that it all works out. And it still works out for my university. If we just stop getting older, we would be okay. What it doesn't work for is the small employer who has 3 employees, one of whom gets a cancer diagnosis. Suddenly, your premiums go through the ceiling. And you're not paying that average $13,000 for a family, you're paying triple that amount. You're priced out. There's also the cost of doing this voodoo risk rating. It really requires looking at everybody who's going to buy insurance and figuring out what their risk is. Again, it's easier if you're looking at everybody at St. Louis University. They can do quick math. But it makes about 10% overhead compared to 5% in Medicare, which doesn't do this, and Medicaid, which doesn't do it. In the small group market, this having to look at each person adds about 20 to 25%, and in the individual market, at least 30 to 35%. In some areas, it can get as high as 50% of the premium is going to overhead. This cost of trying to figure out how much to charge whom. So let me talk about the whammies in the rural area. Oh, and in case you're wondering, why are those musicians up there? Just to tell you, I am from South Louisiana. One of our things that we've done in terms of developing economy is music, our traditional music. And it's been wonderful to see my classmates able to make a living as Cajun and Zydeco musicians. But they can't buy health insurance. They are, one of the small business people who are hit by all of this. Let me give you two other whammies that hit small communities when we get to risk rating. One of them has to do with something I know you're all familiar with, the lack of health insurance providers, right? There really aren't many doctors there. One of the way health insurers have held down costs have been to be tough negotiators with doctors and hospitals trying to lower the price. There's nobody to compete with in a small area. That doctor's got 35% or 25% of his patients who don't have insurance, need some more money, can't negotiate down. The other problem is a lack of health insurers in rural areas. Over the last decade, we've had 400 mergers in the health insurance industry. In most areas in this country, there is one or two insurers who predominate in the market. That is more so in rural areas. There is no dynamic going on to try to push down premiums. It's also the reason we are seeing record profits from for-profit health insurers. We have moved from health insurance being a community benefit to it being large national profit-making corporations. What does this mean for rural areas? I'm going to run through these really fast. It basically means if you could buy the same coverage in a small town in West Virginia, it's going to cost you at least 18% more than if you were buying it here in Morgantown. That's what the studies tell us when you put it all together. And actually, there's a wonderful report in Health Affairs that says West Virginia is in the top 4 states for health insurance premiums, and all of the top 4 are states with high rural populations. I remember Montana and Wyoming being in there. The other problem, though, is it is almost impossible to get comparable health insurance in rural areas. Part of what's happened is a watering down of the health insurance benefits to be able to attract somebody to buy health insurance. So what we see is the health insurance that's offered in rural areas has very high deductibles, has fewer services covered, and is basically worth less, even though you're paying more. We did a study looking at state employees in Missouri because, one of the best jobs you can get in rural Missouri is working for the state. Is that true here? I mean, those are the jobs that everybody wants because, one, they pay more than other jobs, and two, they've got health insurance benefits. And those health insurance benefits are the same no matter where you live. But the premiums are set depending upon the bids they get from the private health insurers. And what these numbers showed us was that the rural premiums are about a third more than the urban premiums for the exact same policies. We also found out that the rural employees were paying a whole lot more out of pocket, even though their benefits were supposed to be the same. No deductible, $20 copay, because there were so few doctors and hospitals in the network. They were always having to go somewhere else to find a doctor. And you know what? This is the best insurance that's available in these communities. We also found out that rural employees were much more likely to try to use their state employees' health benefit to cover their families, because in talking to and surveying urban workers, they were more likely to be in married families where the husband and the wife both had a job with health insurance. In the rural communities, the only jobs that were offering health insurance were the jobs with the state employees. Short version, not only do we have maybe 24% of rural communities uninsured, we have, on average, 12% of the residents who have health insurance that they're paying for every month that doesn't protect them when they get sick. Twice the rate in urban areas. The statistic you hear all the time are the people who are filing for bankruptcy because they don't have health insurance. What it means in a rural community is over a third of the population doesn't have a reliable way to pay for health care. 36% on average. Terrible toll for people. What it means for businesses is if you are trying to set up a small business in a small town, you're going to pay a premium for health insurance. You're not going to be able to offer health insurance, or it's going to cost more. There's a hidden tax that's placed on the businesses that offer health insurance that tries to cover all those people who don't have health insurance or don't have adequate health insurance. And the toll on our rural health providers. 17% of our rural hospitals are at risk of closing because for 3 years they have not brought in enough money to cover. Medicare and Medicaid, our government insurers are trying to pick up the shortfall. The shortfall has become too much. We have a need for trauma centers, because one thing we know in rural areas are people are more likely to get in auto accidents because you have to travel longer distances. It's crucial to have trauma centers, but imagine operating a trauma center when over a third of your patients have no way to pay for trauma care. Travel times and distances we talked about before. So what's the framework of this health insurance bill? The goal is to cover everybody. The statisticians tell us it ought to cover 95% of Americans. The Americans who aren't covered are mostly not citizens. They're mostly undocumented immigrants. What the statisticians tell us is that actually in rural areas, if this bill passes, we're probably going to see something like 96% of rural residents with health insurance. And that is going to be primarily private insurance, because we're going to reform private insurance. We're going to end risk rating. We're going to have standardized benefits so it covers the care that people need. It's going to limit the out-of-pocket costs so we don't have these problems of underinsurance. And there are going to be federal tax credits, which are basically subsidies, because Congress is clear about what the cost of health insurance is. So that families of four earning up to $88,000 will be eligible for premium subsidies so that they will not have to pay more than 9.5% of their income. And if you're thinking about graduating next year, if you're looking at a prosecutor job like they are in Missouri that pay about $45,000, you may also be eligible for premium subsidy to help cover. We're going to expand Medicaid. We're going to expand Medicare. It's all going to work. We're going to fix these problems in the private insurance system that makes it harder to get health insurance in rural communities. But here's what really happens. It's not just health insurance. It's money to pay for medical care. Suddenly, instead of talking to a doctor about, are you interested in locating in a rural community, and the doctor going, yeah, but how do I make a living if a third of my patients can't pay for care? That doctor can think about, oh, I can have a practice in which 96% of my patients can pay for care. For 50 years, it has been more difficult to practice and have a hospital in rural communities. We're about, if we pass this legislation, to change that calculation. There will be a way to build an infrastructure in rural communities. And this is what it might mean for rural communities. For every physician who locates in a small town, it creates 5 jobs. For every health center that locates in a rural community, and there is special money in the bill to support expansion of health centers in rural communities, it creates 45 new jobs and additional jobs as those people start spending their money, amounting to $3.9 million in local economic activity. These are numbers from the National Association of Community Health Centers. This is suddenly community revitalization, because when that hospital, when that doctor, when that health clinic is able to locate, stay, or come to a rural community, it doesn't just create a job for the doctor or the nurse. Somebody's got to be hired to have the job my mom had when I was growing up. She was the receptionist for a dentist. That's a good job. At least it was for her. Somebody's got to keep the books. Somebody's got to keep an eye on the patient. Somebody's got to clean that office building. We suddenly have funding for jobs that now account for 15 to 20% of small town America. This is actually an economic stimulus program, is my short version. There's also money in the bills for capital investment to update rural hospitals, which are aging. There are real issues here, I think, for rural communities, particularly in terms of the style of physician practices. Walmart and Walgreens are very interested in this area. They are very interested in retail medicine. They are now located in many small towns across America. And this is an opportunity for them to become the site of health care because they have the infrastructure set up. As you think about your hometown and you think about your community, do you want that to be the site of your health care? Or do we need to start talking immediately about alternative local-based providers and how we support that capital investment and that capital improvement? We also have room for workforce development and workforce training. There's money in these bills to start training not just new doctors and new nurses, but x-ray technicians and CNAs and all the other people we are going to need to do these jobs. This is a real opportunity for your local technical school, your local high school, your local community college to start creating a trained workforce. Because there's also one thing we know in trying to attract doctors and nurses to small town communities. Do you know the best way to predict whether a doctor will set up a practice in a small town? You know the answer. You don't get to. Can you guess? What's your guess? You would think. I mean, schools are very important. Getting them to a small community. It also works for minority communities, too. No. Where they grew up. People from small towns tend to return to small towns. We liked it there, right? And one way to recruit this workforce is to recruit folks who are in that school system right now in a small town and to give them opportunities for good jobs to stay in those small towns. I've got lots more we can talk about. I hope you have lots of questions. I'm going to end it here with thinking about healthcare as about people, about communities, about building a new economy in small towns that's about what I call a community of care, a way to make a living wage while taking care of each other and creating a viable piece of a new 21st century economy. Thank you.
We are now going to go into a panel discussion on issues of rural health care with Professor Watson, and I am going to introduce some of the panelists who will be speaking as soon as everyone that's done making their exodus makes it. Okay, it's quieting down. Today's panelists, I will introduce them as Dr. Joel Halverson and Dr. Christopher Plein. Dr. Joel Halverson is a research assistant professor at the West Virginia University School of Pharmacy. Dr. Halverson recently joined the Department of Pharmaceutical Systems and Policy School of Pharmacy after serving 10 years in the School of Medicine. He received a Ph.D. in geography from WVU with an emphasis of health disparities. During his career at the Health Sciences Center at WVU, he served as the Associate Director and the Director of the Office for Social Environment and Health Research in the Department of Community Medicine. Among other things, when he worked as the Director of the Office for Social Environment and Health Research, he helped to develop a regional focus on medically underserved populations in the Appalachian region. He is currently working as a core member of the Mary Babb Randolph Cancer Center and has current research that is focusing primarily on cancer disparities in the West Virginia and the Appalachian region. The next panelist that is going to be speaking today, Professor Watson, is Dr. Christopher Plein, an Assistant Dean for the School of Applied Sciences with the West Virginia University Eberly College of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Plein is an Eberly Professor of Outstanding Public Service at WVU. He is a chair of the Division of Public Administration and also serves as the Assistant Dean for WVU's Eberly College of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Plein's area of specialty is public policy formation and implementation. Recently, his research has concentrated on the study of social programs with a special emphasis on the effects of welfare reform and state health policy. Dr. Plein has also been active in university outreach and engagement in West Virginia. In 2004, he was appointed by Governor Wise to serve on the board of directors for the newly established Access WV state health insurance program, which provides health coverage to those with high-risk health conditions. He continues to serve in this role and also provides service to various government committees dealing with the problems of the medically uninsured in this state. Our panel today is going to be moderated by Dean Valerie Vitac, and I hope that you all enjoy it.
Thank you, Brandon. Would you like to begin?
I'll begin just by saying I'm excited about the possibility that she spoke about it. Because most of the health problems in the state and the region have an underlying socioeconomic basis. Originally, I was a bit skeptical, and if I look at the landscape of health outcomes, let's just say in West Virginia, it's difficult. The only difficulty I have is seeing where, for example, in the southern part of the state that tends to suffer the most in terms of health outcomes, a complete lack of infrastructure is a problem I don't know I don't see currently as surmountable. And given the general conditions down there, the lack of economic infrastructure, the lack of social infrastructure, the lack of transportation infrastructure, I'm wrestling with how this would be implemented in that kind of environment. But I see a great hope in other parts of the state.
Can you all hear me? Great. Where is rural health care in West Virginia? It's everywhere. I go to bed at night, and my house is in the flight path of the helicopters that come into Ruby. Where are those helicopters coming from? They're coming from across our state. If we think about it, a state like West Virginia has health care challenges that are not unique, but they're certainly distinct. And I think that's why your presentation today has been so helpful, because I think it helps us place into context the thorny issues that surround healthcare reform in rural areas. And we were asked to prepare a few comments and to respond to you. So I want to focus on three main themes that I think are very important for us to consider in West Virginia. And the first is the West Virginia situation itself. Rural healthcare is important to West Virginia because we are a rural state. We have no major metropolitan areas. In places like Morgantown and places like Charleston, where tertiary care hospitals are located, they serve not only their local residents, not only their local citizens, but the entire state. Those of us who have gone across the state recognize just how important it is to have health care access in a community. As Professor Watson said, in a community, it's the school and it's the hospital that often create the anchor, not only for economy, but also of social infrastructure, of the social capacity and civic capacity of a community. Many folks at West Virginia University have been involved in going to the small towns of our state and helping those small towns think about how they can preserve their hospital and health care and to recruit physicians and healthcare professionals to replace the generation of doctors and others who are retiring or moving out of the state. So if we think about it, the West Virginia situation is very challenging. Rural health care touches all of us. It's not only located in our rural outlying regions of the state, but right here in Morgantown or in downtown Charleston. It's quite discouraging and disappointing to go into some of our communities and realize that they are losing their health care infrastructure. If last night I heard helicopters going across the sky, tonight I fly to Atlanta, Georgia, where tomorrow I'll be in North Georgia giving a paper on our community outreach efforts here in West Virginia through a program called the Community Design Team. And one of the programs and one of the foci of the program is to help those communities think about strategies to retain and recruit physicians. It's also about encouraging communities to situate themselves in terms of a region and how their economic development and how their access to services has to be networked and linked across our state now. Because so many of our rural communities face the challenges of not only of losing population, but of poverty as well. Some of you probably saw the Dominion Post this morning about the healthiest counties in West Virginia and the least healthy counties in West Virginia. And in that report that was focused on in this morning's Dominion Post, you'll see that poverty in rural areas really combine together to create these healthcare challenges. So what should we look forward to? And what should we keep in mind with healthcare reform? It's a big discussion right now. And I think Professor Watson has really given us a great survey of the landscape. But I would suggest to you the following. When folks are talking about healthcare reform, they are talking primarily about third-party payer reform. That's the thing to keep in mind. Whether it's Medicare, whether it's Medicaid, whether it's group or employer-based insurance or individual insurance markets, we are really talking about reforming a third-party payer system. And for hospitals and providers and citizens in West Virginia, this is of crucial importance. If you go out into the field, if you go to a clinic, if you go to a primary care center, if you go to a hospital, the administrators there will tell you that their livelihood depends upon what is called the payer mix. It's the amount of insurance dollars that they're getting from Medicare and from Medicaid, from group and individual insurance. And also, they factor in, of course, the uncompensated care from those who do not have the means to pay for health care. That payer mix is crucial to the viability and the survival of healthcare infrastructure in our state. So much of what we're hearing today out of Washington, D.C., and so much of this discourse and dialogue is about third-party payer reform, whether it's expanding Medicaid, reforming Medicare, writing new regulations in the individual insurance market. It's about third-party reform. And one of the main things to remember is that even if Congress votes this week, and we were joking last night that that's not yet a certain proposition, the implementation process will take years. Will take years. And in fact, that is the design of the health care reform package. And so with decision also comes the challenge of implementation. I've had a great privilege in this state to work with folks in many different places. Many of them are attorneys. Many of them are, a few years ago, were in the situation that you are right now as students. And they go forward and they work for places like healthcare facilities, the Insurance Commission, in the legislature, elsewhere. And they're wrestling with and they're dealing with the fact that they must implement and interpret current policy. I can tell you that the field will be rich for you all as healthcare reform proceeds because there will be so many challenges in implementation. So as we look forward to healthcare reform, keep in mind that a large part of this is about third-party payer reform. For West Virginia, it's also about those provisions of the bill or the proposed legislation that will focus on academic training for healthcare professionals, as well as physician recruitment and retention to rural areas. So I would invite you to give that particular attention. Professor Watson is absolutely correct that the changes that are proposed in the legislation will have a dramatic impact on education, including community and technical colleges. It should also have a dramatic impact on academic medical centers such as West Virginia University and Marshall University. We have a stake in this, and it's very important. Finally, consider the fact that as we implement healthcare reform, if it does come to pass, and I feel confident that whether in bits and pieces or all together, it will come to pass, that there will be very immediate challenges that will be posed to the states. I would invite you all to think about whether it will be a stopgap measure or a permanent part of the healthcare landscape. I want you all to think about the concept of high-risk pools. West Virginia is one of 35 states that have high-risk pools. Our high-risk pool program is called Access West Virginia. Both Republicans and the Democrats agree that high-risk pools will be part of the solution. The disagreement comes as to how long they'll be part of the solution and to what level they'll be funded. But one thing is guaranteed. If healthcare reform in its current form passes, high-risk pools will get a lot of emphasis at the state level. And West Virginia will have challenges adopting and adjusting to new federal legislation to be certain that our pool works under the new policy rubric. So, to sum up, we are a rural state. Rural healthcare reform affects every West Virginian. Morgantown and Charleston are big urban areas, and Huntington too, while might not look like rural areas, have a very important part to play in rural healthcare. Healthcare reform is largely about third-party reform, third-party payer reform, and how that gets regulated and how the dollars get shifted. And in the interim, we will have many, many challenges in implementation and many, many opportunities for those who study the law and practice in the legal profession. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have three questions I'd like to pose for the panelists, and of course you can comment as you will. I mean, first, before we proceed, I'd like to ask Drs. Halverson and Plein if you could expand just a bit on the particular impact that lack of insurance has in West Virginia, in our rural communities. I know, Dr. Halverson, you've been studying the lack of access among cancer patients. Could you just give our audience some specifics, if you have those?
Well, generally speaking, my experience is that health insurance is not necessarily the biggest part of the problem, and you have many insured people, for example, that are so far removed from any medical services or providers that they tend to be greatly underutilized. So I think the first thing that needs to happen is we need to have improved access to medical care services. Having said that, I'm still intrigued by Dr. Watson's proposal about local economic development, and I think that's critical to make, to improve the health of all people, whether they're insured or not.
In terms of the uninsured, again, I'm going to come back to the third-party payer thing and the third-party payer mix. To lack insurance, especially as an adult in this state, is a tremendous challenge. Coming back to what health care reform might mean, if there is Medicaid expansion, and it is brought up to 133% of the federal poverty level, basically for unrestricted access to Medicaid for adults, that will have a transformative effect on the picture of the uninsured in our state. In West Virginia, we have been trying to deal with the issue of the uninsured for years. By the way, this whole issue is not necessarily a federal vanguard or pioneering effort. The states have been wrestling with the issue of the uninsured for years. In fact, we were talking last night at dinner about what Massachusetts has done. West Virginia, under both the Wise and the Manchin administrations, have really struggled with conceptualizing the picture of the uninsured not as one monolithic whole, but as many different subpopulations. And how do you chip away at the issue of the uninsured? So that becomes a big challenge. I will tell you this, if there is an expansion of Medicaid in our state so that we can start to reach more individuals who are adults who would not otherwise qualify, that will be a big change. And that also will deliver upon efforts that have been made in this state for almost 10 years to try to address this issue of Medicaid. The state withholds eligibility for Medicaid right now for adults simply because even with a generous match rate, in other words, with a generous amount of federal dollars coming in, it is very difficult for our state to afford this coverage. This does bring us back also to the issue that there's two sides to this equation. There's the money that comes into the system to provide for health coverage, but there are also the enduring issues of cost that we must address as well. And this is also a big piece of the health insurance reform initiative.
Another question I had, to what extent do you think the political process works to specifically focus on rural poverty and lack of health care? I mean, there was an article just this morning in the New York Times about a critique of the No Child Left Behind legislation and about how the remedies that have been formulated to improve student performance really weren't geared for rural areas. For example, termination of teachers really wasn't an acceptable or feasible option if you don't have enough teachers in your community to make up the difference. To what extent do you think that's been a problem with this health care debate?
I am a public administrator. Okay? I study public policy, and I train people to implement public policy. Decades ago, there was a well-known administrator who worked in the Roosevelt and the Truman administrations. His name was David Lilienthal. He was the head of the TVA, and he was the head of the Atomic Energy Commission. Now, I'm going to paraphrase somewhat what he said. But he had a well-known saying, and he basically said that when politics enters, the entire edifice, which has been built upon by expertise, will crumble. And what he meant by this was the following. We make many assumptions when we define problems and when we offer or propose solutions. It is crucial when we engage in public policy discussion that we question how the problem has been structured, how the problem has been defined, and whose definition prevails. Then we also have to take into account what are the solutions that are being proposed and what are the assumptions behind that solution. Political scientists have long said that by defining the problem, you also define the solution. We know that as well in legal studies. And the one-size-fits-all concern, which I think you're getting at, is apt. And it not only applies to health care, but it applies to welfare reform. It applies to education and many areas of public policy. What's interesting with this health care reform debate is that much of it really is a referenda on existing public policy and how it will be operated and how it will be reformed. It's also, in some regards, assumptions about individuals and about their behaviors and about their needs. The development of public policy really relies upon us questioning the underlying assumptions, having meaningful dialogue about this, which I think has been absent in much of this debate. And also recognizing that the solutions that we develop really have to take into account the challenges of implementation and how they'll be implemented in different contexts and different areas. Joel? Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe I'll give you a lawyer's answer to what I think the question was. How do the politics, or do they focus on rural areas? I think it's very hard when you talk to people in a small town or elected officials to talk to them about health insurance, because that's what third-party payer reform, because they say our problem is we don't have a doctor, we don't have a hospital. Why do I care about having health insurance? I don't have anybody to go to. And so the dialogue breaks down at that point. That's why I wanted to spend a little bit of time explaining how health insurance can create the funding stream to create the infrastructure. Because part of what we have tried to do for the last 20 years is come up with various mechanisms to put our finger in the dye, some special funding for this, some special funding from that, none of which works without that stable funding mechanism which we know that health insurance can provide. But it's really hard when people are in desperate economic times looking for a job, as we talked about last week, to be able to kind of step back and see that big picture framework. And then it all gets involved in the other kinds of debates that become part of the politics.
I understand less about the political process, but if I had to guess, I would say that the rural populations likely feel disenfranchised by the political process because by virtue of their condition in terms of being high unemployment, low income, poor health outcomes, and very likely are distrusting of the political process as a result.
Moving beyond, I think your talk was absolutely fascinating about the development implications of the current reform of the health insurance system. I mean, I'd like to ask all of the panelists, what steps do you see that we should be moving toward once we hopefully fix the health insurance issues? I mean, what other types of reforms in health care? I mean, if you were to pick a couple, I know, of course, there's probably a slew, but one or two that each of you see that could specifically help rural areas and West Virginia in particular, or rural areas in general?
I think I'm going to not answer the question because I think we're in agreement. The implementation of the health insurance parts are going to take us 10 years. Let me promise you that if you're a law student looking for a job, this is going to be a wonderful opportunity to do really important work that structures our society going forward. We are going to need to come up with state-level rules for how we reform health insurance and also how we enforce those rules, which is going to be at the state level. And that's something that Congress has not talked about because we lawyers think about enforcing rules. They just think about writing. the rules. So the next stage is a long way down there. I do think one really good thing that the legislation does is it funds a lot of demonstration projects. So there are demonstration projects for developing rural continuum of care, rural medical homes, urban-rural partnerships, telemedicine. And I actually had 3 law students who wrote papers on this last semester, and we convinced ourselves that it really does make sense to use demonstration funding rather than attempts at whole hog reform for these delivery system issues, because we have some ideas about what works. But we really need to test out ideas, and demonstrations gives us a chance to give different communities the opportunity to experiment and then replicate what works and let go of what didn't work. And we really are at that stage. Atul Gawande is one of my favorite writers about medical care. He's a physician in Boston. I highly recommend to you a December New Yorker article he wrote where he suggested that these demonstration projects are very much like agricultural extension programs. Do you all know what those are? I mean, I do. I grew up with those. My St. Louis U students don't. But the local ag agent who goes out and advises the farmer and helps with different little ideas, that we really need that approach to working one-on-one with hospital systems and doctors to really think about better care delivery that will work in place. Because I have a feeling that these communities you're talking about here in West Virginia are very different from the farming communities I go to in Northwest Missouri. And the economies are different. The solutions are going to be different. The dynamics are different.
Actually, I have an answer to your question, not from me, but actually from a healthcare administrator out in the field. Almost anticipated this question. It's interesting. I was talking to him last week. He's an administrator for what's called a Federally Qualified Health Center, or an FQHC. And FQHCs and rural health clinics really are a very, very important part of our rural health care infrastructure in West Virginia. This particular FQHC was in one of our state's more urbanized areas, but it was serving outlying areas that were quite rural. And I asked him, I said, you know, what is the big challenge of reform for you? And after we talked about the payment side of things, he said that the federal government needs to dedicate more money, redirect more money to encourage, to incentivize the training of primary care physicians. If you think about it, with the use of incentives, with the use of fiscal tools, as well as regulatory tools, we can change some of the capacity aspects of healthcare delivery. And he basically said this. He said, Chris, it's so difficult to recruit primary care physicians, and it's so difficult to retain them. To begin with, there's not a big supply. Some of you all know this. They go into specializations in their medical training because that's where the rewards are. That's where the dollars are. If somehow the federal government could really step up effort in academic medical training to encourage more people to go into primary care and to stay in primary care, that would make a big difference. And that's a tool that's a tool that can be, I should say, that's a result that can be achieved not only through spending tools that government use, but also regulatory tools as they decide to what degree and how to reimburse for various services. It's a big, big issue.
Can I say 2 things? Can I make a plug for a book? You mentioned federally qualified health clinics. The American Bar Association has just published a new book to encourage lawyers to get involved in community economic development. And I contributed a chapter on what lawyers can do to work with their local communities to bring and expand federally qualified health clinics to their communities. So it's really an opportunity to do interesting lawyering work. The other lawyering issue I think you brought up is we tend to talk about a primary care shortage, and we tend to focus on physicians and the need for physicians. But there are really interesting questions about expanding the workforce for nurse practitioners, physician's assistants, nurse midwives. And those are often at the first level licensing law issues. What is the permissible scope of practice for non-physician providers? And there's really important work we can do as lawyers to facilitate that conversation, which often gets very heated from well-intentioned people who have different roles, different ideas of who ought to do what, and in working to revise and reform those licensing laws to increase the scope of practice.
And I have a somewhat different perspective. I think that in addition to improving access and accessibility and utilization of health care, we should focus a bit more effort on reducing the need for care. And by that I mean focusing more on prevention, health literacy, and those types of things, so that fewer and fewer people need to take advantage of the health care system because they're healthy.
I can give you another lawyer job here. One of the provisions of the bill is going to allow some variation in premiums, possibly up to 30% for wellness incentives, for employers to use that. And it's kind of this demonstration idea, promoting the idea you're talking about, encouraging people to live healthy lifestyles. Many of us, including me, are worried that if those regulations are not drafted very, very carefully and enforced very, very carefully, that will simply become an excuse to charge people who are sick higher rates. We can't control when we get cancer. We can't control a lot of things. So this is going to require that kind of attention to details that lawyers are good at.
And I'd just like to add one point. One of the things we're doing here at the law school in this regard is we've set up a medical legal partnership with our health sciences colleagues in the pediatrics department, and we have a new legal clinic, child and family health and advocacy, that will be starting next year. And we hope to be working with the pediatrics department as lawyers to help address some of the social and economic barriers to health that children here face. For example, kids with asthma who have landlords who won't clean up mold, which contributes to their poor health. So lawyers and law students can also assist in that effort as well. I think we're almost out of time. Is there any one question from the audience? Someone has a burning desire to raise? Otherwise, we have a reception outside where the panelists will be available to answer any questions you may have. All right.
I was a former tax administrator, and one thing I learned is that embedded in all the tax codes, one thing I learned was that embedded in all the tax codes are social assumptions and programs. And so it sounds good to have a flat tax, but when you do that, there are winners and losers. And I would just like to know, in terms of the $900 billion cost, who are the winners and losers in terms of economic shifts? And I just in the short term, I mean, this thing got so political with the Louisiana purchase and the Nebraska kickback or whatever.
I'm from Louisiana. We liked that part.
Yeah. I'm sure the senator from Nebraska liked his deal, too. But it got very political, and that's the reason there was a lot of shifting going on here. And I've never really understood where the money's coming from. And in the long run, of course, we'll all be better off and we'll have a more thriving economy. But in the, if you're talking 10 years for one part of the program to be implemented, that's a long term. So in the short term, who are the winners and losers?
You want me to go? Sure. In the As we move into implementation, the winners are going to be those who depend on the individual market now, the small employer market. That's where we're going to bring down costs. It's going to be moderate income Americans, again, earning up to $88,000 for a family of 4, who are going to be eligible for, these are termed as tax credits in the Act. It's interesting when you go to the website of the Democratic leadership, they are now talking about this premium assistance as the largest tax cut for moderate income Americans. And I think that is an accurate way to think about this. So it really is targeted at, the paradigm of rural small towns where people depend on that individual market, that small employer market, self-insured people who don't get the benefits of that large employer.
I think it's a good question. I actually think that we're not yet at the point where we're not going to know who all the winners and losers are. And let me explain that for just a moment. A lot of this is going to be in the implementation process. Let me just give an example with the high-risk insurance pools. The high-risk insurance pools, I don't know if anybody got a chance to dip into the Blair House Summit. If not, watch some of it. It's very, very interesting. 2 big issues came up again and again during that summit: pre-existing conditions and high-risk insurance pools. The basic notion is this. Right now, if you have a pre-existing condition, either your coverage is rated so high that you cannot afford insurance, or that condition, coverage for that condition, is excluded from your insurance. The idea behind a high-risk pool is to provide an opportunity for people to move into a program such as a high-risk pool in order to get insurance coverage. There are going to be very, very significant definitional battles fought about what will or will not get you into a high-risk pool and how pre-existing conditions will be regulated, if you will, to allow for coverage in the regular individual insurance market. Much of the debate over the cost of health care reform is not so much a debate about a new net gain or new net add in the cost of health care reform, but how will the resources be redistributed in the existing health care system. So some suggest that maybe insurance companies will lose a bit. However, if a very vital and expansive high-risk insurance pool system is adopted as a byproduct of all this, the health care insurance companies actually might benefit from this. States might benefit from expansion of Medicaid because in many ways, as Professor Watson suggested, it is a stimulus package in a way to help build a health care infrastructure. And in fact, that argument's been used before in West Virginia. About 5 or 6 years ago, the West Virginia University Bureau for Business and Economic Research did a study of the economic impact of Medicaid in the respective counties of West Virginia. They did this because there was concern that the state might pull back on its Medicaid contributions. And as you and I talked about last night, it's been done in other states as well, similar studies. So the winners and losers are not yet clear-cut. A lot of the winners and losers will be determined, if you will, in a relative sense through the implementation process as we start to define this. But right now, I think we could suggest that folks who are able to get coverage will be winners. Healthcare providers who will get reimbursement for the services they provide will be winners. States may be winners as well as we think about the economic stimulus impact of all this. The cost will be borne not only by players right now, but Professor Hardesty, as you and I have talked about before as well, there is a future generation aspect of this as the cost will go forward.
Addressing your question, in the short term, who are the losers, I think I'm willing to go on record. I keep looking at the long term once all these pieces are in place. I don't have much faith in the high-risk pool short-term provisions of the bill. They were added because partly it just takes a while to create this new legal infrastructure we need, partly to pull down the overall costs of the bill if we have a few years of transition. But my reading of the high-risk pool provisions, I think many Americans are going to be disappointed. I think we're likely to be revisiting those short-term provisions very quickly to change both the eligibility for the high-risk pool and the funding. So in the short term, there's going to be a lot of movement. In the long run, you know, there are some potential losers. And I want to address you young men in the room, because the bill does ask something of you. And that is that you agree to buy into a system where your health insurance is going to cost more than it does right now, where you can go out into the individual market and buy a really cheap policy as long as you don't get sick. And part of this message of everybody paying into the pool and the idea of an individual mandate is that we need everybody, even in those years when they're young and healthy, to pay something into the pool so that there's a pool big enough there to cover your grandparents and your parents. And so maybe you think of yourselves as losers. I think of changing the idea of what insurance is. It's a pool where we all contribute a fair share. And I think we'll be debating for at least your generation what that fair share is.
Thank you so much. I think this was such a fascinating panel and a fabulous end to this lecture series. I want to thank all of the panelists. And I also wanted to use this opportunity to thank Brandon Stump, who thanked everyone else, but he and as well as everyone in the Law Review, because I think this was a truly wonderful lecture series, and that all of your work as students really has contributed to the intellectual life of our, not only the law school, but of our university. You picked a really timely topic, one that is not going away, and I'm just really thrilled to have been able to work with you, and so we thank you from our community. And please join us for the reception outside.